We're continuing in Genesis chapter 18. I'm going to read a portion. The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to meet them, bowed down to the ground, and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor with you, please do not go past your servant. Let a little water be brought that you may wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree. I will bring a bit of bread so that you may strengthen yourselves. This is why you have passed your servant's way. Later, you can continue on." "Yes," they replied, "do as you have said." So Abraham hurried into the tent and said to Sarah, "Quick, knead 3 measures of fine flour and make bread." Abraham ran to the herd and got a tender, choice calf. He gave it to the young man to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk, as well as the calf that he had prepared, and he set it before the men, and he served them, and they ate under the tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he answered. The Lord said, "I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight?" But the Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I am old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in a year, she will have a son." Sarah denied it and said, "I did not laugh because she was afraid." He replied, "No, you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord.
You may know the author Lewis Carroll. He wrote about a fictional character named Alice. And Alice chased a suit-wearing rabbit down a rabbit hole, and she fell until she landed in Wonderland. In Wonderland, there's a potion that can make you shrink, there's a cake that can make you grow, animals can talk, cats can disappear, and little girls can slay Jabberwockies. Alice took a little while to come around to the impossibilities of Wonderland. To Wonderland and its impossibilities. And in Carroll's sequel, Through the Looking Glass, Alice had a conversation with the Queen of Hearts, you may remember her as the big-headed character, about the Queen's age. And we're going to say the Queen's age was old, but the conversation went something like this. "I can't believe that," Alice cried. "Can't you?" the Queen said in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "Well, I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." "Well, I dare say that if you consider yourself a Christian today, you have had a lot of practice in believing impossible things. And if you're not a Christian, then today may be the day that you start." In our passage today, the Lord asks Sarah and expects Sarah to believe in an impossible conception. And likewise, he expects us to believe in an impossible salvation. And along the way, I'll offer our own 6 impossible things. I didn't try to make it 6, it just happened that way. I wasn't trying to line up with Alice in Wonderland. But the key to remember is that although it seems impossible to us, it is possible because of the Lord. The narrative breaks down pretty cleanly into a meal in verses 1 through 8 and a conversation in 9 through 15. We're going to be spending most of our time in the conversation, but first, the meal. In verses 1 through 8, Abraham is relaxing on his front porch. He's relaxing underneath some trees in the heat of the day, when suddenly movement catches his eye and 3 men are coming up onto his camp. Being hospitable, he runs after them, invites them into his home, and he offers rest, a foot bath, and a light snack. The visitors accept, and then Abraham rushes off to put together way more than a snack. This is a full-blown feast. We're talking 7 loaves of Sarah-made bread, a couple dozen pounds of farm-to-table veal, some organic butter, and some raw milk. Abraham serves up these heavy hors d'oeuvres, and he stands by for a full-service dining experience. And I want to point out that it seems that Abraham does recognize that this is the Lord, even though the Lord appears in male form. The word for Lord that he uses is primarily used to refer to the divine Lord. It's Adonai with a Y. And the other 2 men, they're most likely angels that are going to come up next week in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I do want to acknowledge that they're there, but we're going to focus mainly on the Lord. So even with recognizing the Lord, Abraham's responses are normal, very ordinary. To press for the visitors to come in, to offer a small meal, to return with a much larger meal. This is all just the cultural custom of the day. In fact, it continues today in the Near East. Our mission partners, B&R, who are over there now, they experience the same thing. Neighbors will invite them over. They'll think they're having a light snack, but then they eat their hearts out, and it barely looks like they made a dent in the feast. This is all normal, but even Abraham bowing to the Lord is normal here. It's very ordinary, and it contrasts sharply with the last chapter, where Abraham is said to have fallen on his face in worship. So what gives? What's the difference in the response? It's as if the Lord appears in various filtered ways that allow us to comprehend and to know him more fully. One appearance for worship, one another for a conversation. And I think this is a kindness for us as his creation, especially when you consider the other ways that the Lord has appeared. I think of Ezekiel's first vision of the glory of the Lord. There's a great bright cloud of flashing fire. Out of the cloud come 4 living creatures with 4 wings. They look like humans, but they also have 4 wings. There's 4 tall and awesome wheels, but they're within wheels, and they shine like gems, and they roam the earth back and forth, to and fro. But you can't forget the shining, awe-inspiring expanse, because there's a throne there, and there's a being on the throne, and the being looks like a human, but he also looks like he's on fire. Where do you even look if you're Ezekiel? Like, what? You can't take his eyes off of it, but he can barely take it in. This is wildly different from what we see in Genesis 18, where the Lord appears to Abraham at such an intimate level that Abraham is able to serve him a meal. Which brings us to the first impossible thing. The first impossible thing is that we can know an unknowable God. In one sense, we will never fully know all that there is about God, or that we'll never fully know God himself. But on the other hand, what is remarkable or impossible, seems impossible, is that we are able to know him at all. We're like the baby who grins and kicks when his father's face comes into view. The baby doesn't know his father's height, his job, or his favorite food, but he still recognizes his dad. He still smiles and grins and kicks. So the Lord physically reveals himself to Abraham here, and he reveals himself through his word to us. And knowing his word doesn't mean that we just get to know a lot of facts about God, but we get to know and experience him. Check this verse out from Jeremiah 9:24. Him who boasts, Christina told me there were no slides. Him who boasts in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord. Incredibly, we can know and understand the Lord. Like any good dinner party, the pot doesn't get stirred until after the food is served. So let's move to the conversation in verse 9. Where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he answered. The Lord said, I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. So she laughed to herself. After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight? And given the evidence, especially with Sarah hiding behind the tent curtain, it's kind of hard to blame her here. When she counts up all of Abraham's birthdays, when she considers that she physically went through menopause, all the physical signs of this conception seem impossible. There's no way. This guest is making just such rash promises that there's no way that Sarah's going to believe it. It's laughable. Of course she doesn't believe, but it's actually her that's ignorant here, because you can bet that the Lord knew exactly who Sarah was and exactly what he was promising her, which is the second impossible thing, that we are known by God. We can know God, but he knows us. The creator of the universe, who holds the depths of the earth and the heights of the mountains in his hands, and who sustains the world's existence by his word, is the very God who numbers the hairs on your head, who knits you together in your mother's womb, who knows your every strength, your every weakness. He is the God who calls you by name. He knows you. And even though he knows Sarah by name, the Lord does not address her directly when he perceives her laughter and disbelief. He keeps his conversation directed towards Abraham. In verse 13, but the Lord asked Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible? Can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? If this is your first Sunday with us, what you may not know is that Sarah wasn't the first covenant member to laugh. The Lord had already made this promise to Abraham in the last chapter. It was the exact same promise, the timing, who the son was coming from, what to name him. And Abraham responds exactly the same as Sarah. He laughs, he questions, but his response gets no rebuke. And Abraham, he knew it was the Lord making the promise. He was flat on his face worshiping. So why is Sarah getting the rebuke and not Abraham? Romans 4 and John 8 work together to tell us that Abraham had no disbelief, but primarily joy. Someone described the difference as Abraham having a smile of delight and Sarah having a sneer of disbelief, almost a scoffing. But Abraham may have laughed in joy, but I suspect the Lord still has him on the hook here for not communicating the promise to Sarah, especially since the covenant of promise is coming from her womb. The Lord expected Sarah to already know the promise. And the Lord was expecting belief from both of his covenant people, Abraham and Sarah. This word of expectation may come off funny to say that the Lord expects of us, but this expectation stems from God's consistent character. Only a perfect, unchanging God gets to rightly expect faith and allegiance. This is why for us, we don't get to share in this. So this is why whenever we make a large commitment or a large purchase, we have to sign the dotted line. We have to put some collateral up with the commitment, but not God. And it just turns out that the God that we worship is perfect and unchanging. He is right to expect us to take him at his word. So second question, why did Sarah laugh? And now the most important question today, is anything impossible for the Lord? At the essence of the question, this is the Lord announcing to Sarah that I am the promise maker. He makes the case for his truthfulness based on his very character. And this is, again, only effective because he is the Lord. He is the Lord that abounds in covenant love and faithfulness. He keeps covenant love for generations. For example, have you ever had to, at work, make some kind of bargain and say something along the lines of, hey, it's me, trust me, I'll take care of it. Trust me, you put it off to the side, I got it. And then soon after, something falls through. It may have been outside of your control, but it goes up in flames, and you have to go back to that person, and you've now lost their trust. God has not experienced that. God has never fallen through on a promise. And of course, the actual answer to the Lord's rhetorical question is no. All right? Nothing is impossible for the Lord. No task is too hard for him to complete. No miracle is too miraculous for him to perform. But I do want to throw a speed bump out here as we apply this, because we must be very careful to see that this is a question that is tied to what he promised. He promised Abraham and Sarah a son. That's the promise. And what is impossible is not him completing that promise. So we must be wise and see that God is only required to do the impossible things that he has promised to do. No more, no less. We would do well to know that we are not able to, as one commentator puts it, dictate to the Lord what impossible thing he must do. And hopefully this sets anyone free who's been doubting God's love because it's in his providence to not deliver on some, we'll say financial windfall or physical healing, some other thorn in your flesh that he hasn't removed. Your doubts and unbelief do not affect God's love for you, brothers and sisters. And on the other hand, don't let this discourage your prayers. We'll see this next week, because the Lord hears, and he very well may answer prayers that he wouldn't have otherwise. But we are guaranteed only what God has promised. We're going to see that what he has promised is great, but we do want to make that clarification. The third impossible thing is that God makes promises. As God, he's not required to enter into covenant with anyone. He can will and work creation as he pleases without consulting or requiring our participation. But yet he makes promises. God desires communion and fellowship with his people. He's willing to bring us into closer relationship with him. Let's finish the passage after a drink of water. But the Lord asked Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year, she will have a son. Sarah denied it. I did not laugh, she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, no, you did laugh. Sarah's disbelief instantly turns to belief when she realizes that it is the living God who is making the promise. And that belief brings fear. which again sounds odd. She realizes how offensive the laughter was now. No one wants to be known as the person who laughed at God, which leads to the next impossible thing, that God is faithful to his promises even when we are not. The Lord is faithful to his promises even when we are not. The Lord may very well be put off by Sarah's laughter, by her disbelief, but he doesn't just lash out and destroy her immediately. He doesn't retaliate by withdrawing the promise or changing the promise. He just simply restates it. This is what I'm going to do, despite your unbelief. We're probably not very familiar with this in our lives. Think about how many times you experience blame passing, angry emails, or just cold shoulders. Some of your parents may have done this. They may have been quick to withdraw their love when you didn't meet their expectations. Some of us may be acting like those parents now. Or perhaps even your love towards your spouse has turned cold and conditional. But here, God's rebuke contains no consequences. It is unconditional love. God's covenant love is kept the same. God's rebuke is strong. It is not unkind. God rebukes and disciplines the ones he loves. And at the same time, he is patient and merciful. But it's safe to assume that I think if we were in Sarah's place, we would fear God's rebuke. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But let me remind you where the Lord's rebuke is taking place. That this is a conversation between Abraham, Sarah, and the Lord. And it's coming around a dinner table. And it's coming around a table of peace, not judgment. And I think that's why this almost seemingly throwaway passage, I joked that this was the scene, if I were at the movie theater, this is the scene that I would run to the bathroom through. It seems just in between two very serious scenes. But I think this is important to us because it shows a larger pattern in Scripture, especially with God's covenants. One, that God makes the covenants, God seals the covenant with blood, and he shows the peace of the covenant with a meal. So in Abraham's case, we see this in Genesis 15. God makes the covenant with Abraham, and then he seals the covenant with blood. They split the animals in half, the Lord passes through, there's the sealing of the blood. And then in 18, we see that they share the peace of the covenant with a meal. The next series shows up in Exodus. Israel's exiting from Egypt. On Mount Sinai, God and Israel make a covenant. They use Moses as an intermediary. Moses takes the law, what Moses calls the book of the covenant, back to the Israelites. He reads it over them. The Israelites accept. They say, yes, whatever the Lord has spoken, we will do. We will be obedient. And so to seal the covenant, they take the blood of oxen and they spray it on the altar and the people. So the blood of the covenant seals it, but then they receive an invitation from God. God invites Moses and 73 other leaders up the mountain to be in his presence. They see God. Their experience is actually described slightly similar to Ezekiel's, maybe without some of the details. But we read in verse 11 of Exodus 24 that God did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. On the mountain, in the middle of what's described as God's thunderous and lightning presence, they ate with peace, and they ate with God. So the fifth impossible thing is that peace with God is possible. Hopefully you can see the point of the pattern. To dine with God is to be near God. And to be near God is to be at peace with God. And to be at peace with God is to be within his covenant. But to be within his covenant requires blood to be spilled. The last place we'll see this pattern play out is, of course, in the life of Jesus. The Word that became flesh and dwelt among us, the very peak of God's immanence and nearness. So Jesus' ministry, he established the new covenant through various promises based on his character, just like the Lord here in Genesis 18. The book of John includes 7 I am statements where Jesus uses his character to base his promises on. I'll read just 3 of them. John 6, I am the bread of life. There's the character. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. John 8, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Jesus promises that because he is who he says he is, we can have peace. We can be satisfied. We can have the light of life. We can have eternal life if only we believe in him. And after 3 years of announcing the new covenant, Jesus seals the new covenant with his blood. And it's his blood. He's tortured and crucified. It spills on the ground. His blood spills on the ground. A question we could ask here, why did it need to be his blood? Because it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Okay? Well, it may be up the ante. Would other human blood have worked here? No, because we are not spotless sheep. We have all sinned. We have made ourselves at war, not peace with God. So yes, it had to be the perfect Son of God and his violent death to make peace between God and those who believe in Jesus. We can look to his disciples. They witnessed him on the cross. They saw his body go limp as life left it. They watched his body be buried in a tomb and may have been thinking, how could a dead person possibly deliver on eternal life? Like Sarah's old age and barrenness, all the physical circumstances around Jesus pointed to an emphatic failure of his promises. But is anything impossible for the Lord? Is any task too hard for him to complete? Is any miracle too miraculous for him to perform? And our last and most important impossible thing that we are expected to believe is that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. Plain and simple. He is alive. He was seen by hundreds of eyewitnesses. Many have gone out to try to prove that it was a hoax. Many have tried to cover it up. All have failed. We can only look to the disciples for their responses to the resurrection. If anyone was convinced of Jesus' death, it was them. But after his resurrection, they were so convinced of its reality, its necessity, and its urgency that they quite literally gave up their lives for the sake of this impossible thing. So because of his life, because of his resurrection, because of his death and because of his resurrection, those who believe in him are at peace with God. Those who believe have received eternal peace with God. But the last piece of the pattern is, of course, the meal. We'll have a shadow of it here at the Lord's Supper, but we look to the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven. Abraham's hospitality and what he served was probably pretty polite, and again, a cultural norm, but this meal will be glorious. And it will be a final sign. There will be nothing else after that to show the peace. It will be accomplished. There will be no more disbelief. And with all these impossibilities, maybe you're like Sarah. Maybe you struggle to believe. Maybe even sneer at these impossible things. Are you ashamed because you share more in common with Sarah's disbelieving laughter than you care to admit? Have you forgotten who has promised you eternal life? Do you fear that the Lord won't love you anymore because of your struggle with disbelief? Do you look at the sin in your life and jump to the conclusion that you are too far gone, that it is impossible for you to be at peace with God? If you answered yes to any of those, may I suggest seeking God. If you draw near to him, he will draw near to you. He wants you to know him. He knows you. He has promised you possible peace. He is faithful when you are faithless. And as you know him more and more, your disbeliefs and fears will subside. Keep seeking his face. You may be curious of how the story ends for Sarah. Turn to Genesis 21. Verse 1, the Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And famously, Isaac, of course, means he laughs. Let's skip down to verse 6. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son for him in his old age. Despite the laughter of disbelief, God follows right on through with the promise. It happened exactly as he said it would, when he said it would, and how he said it would. Sarah's sneer of disbelief is turned to a smile of delight. And she cannot help but to bring others in to share in this laughter. It's the first, but far from the last, of God's promises with Abraham to come true. And if you look back, it took about 25 years for this first covenant promise to come true. It was a marathon of faith, not a sprint. And so too is our race of faith. Like the Queen of Hearts, we'll have much practice in believing impossible things, but we'll only be responsible for believing one impossible thing: that Jesus lived, died, and rose from the dead so that we may be at peace with God. You will have good days and bad days of practicing this belief, but do not rebuke your own disbelief more harshly than the Lord would. Because however small your faith may be, as long as it exists, it is enough. We look in Hebrews at the very end, because we said earlier, no one wants to be remembered as the person who laughed at God. That's not how Sarah's remembered. In Hebrews, Sarah's laughter at disbelief was still counted as faith. It says that she still received power because she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Will you consider the promise maker to be faithful? Will you believe the impossible thing of your salvation? Because what I'm telling you is not just a possibility of what could happen, of possibility of impossible things. It is a guarantee, because the promise maker is God. He is trustworthy and true. He is steadfast and merciful. He is compassionate and all-powerful. Nothing is impossible for the Lord.